Hello, scaredy cats. It's me, Scaredy Matt. Here I am launching a YouTube channel where I can goof off and talk about horror movies. And I really wanted to not get all up my own butt about it. I wanted to make a video about Basket Case. I had a whole thing planned about Basket Case, but I just can't. Basket Case will have to wait until next week when I definitely talk about Basket Case. If I'm gonna talk about horror, I should probably outline exactly what I think that is, right? How else can you know what to expect from this? Horror is a pretty broad category, and depending on how it's defined, it can actually be pretty overwhelmingly broad, to the point that there's no real focus. Like any genre, the boundaries are kind of blurry. We know what a horror movie is, but it's kind of difficult to know why a movie is a horror movie and why other movies aren't. So, against my better judgment, let's immediately get really pretentious and ask ourselves, what are horror? And what aren't horror? I can tell you one thing, horror is hard to say over and over. Eventually, it just sounds like you're saying whore, which is rude. I'm not saying whore. Everybody keep your giggles to yourself. So let's get the easy one out of the way. If you ask most people, they'll tell you that horror is media that's scary. Right away, a problem should jump out at you for that definition, like a monster jumping out of a lake. What is and is not scary is subjective. I watch all kinds of horror movies, and very few of them actually scare me. By this definition, I'd have only seen like 3 actual horror movies in my entire life, and only 1 in the past 10 years. I'm also scared of a lot of things which aren't necessarily horror related. I'm scared of disease. That doesn't make a drama about someone dealing with cancer a horror movie. I'm scared of ending up in a cult. That doesn't make any documentary about a cult a horror movie. I'm scared of having to socialize with people, but that doesn't make every phone call a horror phone call. So okay, horror might not always be scary, but its intent is to be scary, right? Well, no, not really. If that were true, there couldn't really be horror comedies. Tucker and Dale versus Evil, every Friday the 13th movie after like part 5, Ash versus the Evil Dead, Cabin in the Woods. The friggin' Scream would all be comedies, parodies of horror movies rather than horror movies in their own right. And that doesn't seem right to me. But even if you grant that all of those movies are comedies and not real horror for whatever dumb reason, there's another problem with that definition. Some movies that are categorically not horror are trying to scare you for other reasons. In 1936, a little movie called Reefer Madness, then called Tell Your Children, was released. The film was financed by a small church group to educate the public about the dangers of marijuana. Now don't get me wrong, people can have all sorts of bad reactions to pot. It can affect some people's mental health in a negative way. It does not, however, turn you into a murderous maniac, and most marijuana users are not confined to lunatic asylums. The film exaggerates the effects of marijuana so cartoonishly that it was picked up by exploitation filmmaker Dwayne Esper and marketed as a lurid, pulpy exploitation movie. See, Reefer Madness is trying to scare you, but it's not really a horror movie. Even though it has a lot of genre staples, criminal insanity, violence, murder. But it feels weird to call that a horror movie, doesn't it? Doesn't got a Dracula in it. By the way, Reefer Madness, public domain. You can watch the whole thing legally here on YouTube. Link in the description. You're welcome. Similarly, a movie like The Day After Tomorrow is trying to scare you by taking the very real threat of climate change and making it into the world's dumbest premise for a shitty action movie. Trying to make people afraid of climate change. It failed, but it tried. Or how about this ridiculous movie, The Reliant, about how Antifa guys are gonna take over the United States and take guns away from Christians like Hercules. That one's gonna scare the hell out of every single one of your boomer-ass relatives that still actively posts on Facebook. It's not a horror movie. I mean, it doesn't feel like one, right? Well, okay, to one degree or another, all 3 of these examples are propaganda. Whether they're trying to push a silly idea, like weed is a murder plant, or pointing out the genuine danger of climate change, don't at me, in an albeit completely silly way, they're all trying to send a political message. Their goal isn't to scare you for its own sake, they want to scare you to get you to agree with their political position. So then, horror's goal should be to scare you for its own sake, to entertain you by scaring you. Incidentally, that's the definition that Wikipedia goes with. And to me, this is the worst definition, because it puts so many constraints on what horror can or should be. Does the movie cease to be horror just because it has a message? Just because the people who made it had an intent beyond merely scaring you? That kind of makes horror empty. The only things which count as true horror by this definition are the bits of media that have nothing to say. No point. Just there to provide a cheap thrill. And don't get me wrong, lots of horror is just that. Cheap garbage designed to spook you and turn a quick buck. But that's true of all art. Not the spook you part, but the rest of it. The majority of any art form is cheap, shitty, cynical commercial garbage. To define horror movies this way robs them of their ability to tell a story, to have anything meaningful to say beyond booga booga. Now there's nothing wrong with schlock. I love schlock, don't get me wrong. But to reduce the entirety of this genre that I love to nothing more than a carnival ride? Something to spook you but never make you think or challenge you or make you feel anything? That really rubs me the wrong way. And I think it contributes to an obnoxious attitude that people have towards horror. The idea that it's somehow dumber, more cynical, or less than other genres. That it's essentially just pornography, but for Thanatos instead of Eros. In truth, that's the real reason I wanted to make this video. I wanted a way to express that this genre can be so much more than that. It means things to people, it affects people on deep personal levels like any other artwork. And even the schlocky stuff can move people in ways that you might not expect. Tune in next week when I explain why the beauty of Basket Case almost brought me to tears. That's not a joke. Genre is a difficult thing to pin down. In truth, there is no hard and fast rule for what does and does not constitute a horror movie. Alex Ross Perry's Queen of Earth is an artsy-fartsy character piece about two women dealing with deteriorating mental health issues, and is genuinely one of the scariest things I have ever seen. Is it a horror movie, though? I don't feel like it is. One shortcut a lot of people might use to label genres is to go by conventions, and horror certainly has plenty of conventions. I mean, like, not conventions where people... Horror has both kinds of conventions, both places where people gather to talk about it and also tropes. A genre could be seen as a collection of these conventions, common ideas and common themes that each movie shares. They borrow from one another in a cinematic language that is unique to that genre. You don't need to be told what a force field is, because you've seen it in lots of sci-fi movies. You don't need to be told that two conventionally attractive single characters who fight with each other at the beginning of a rom-com will be in love by the end of the movie. And there's no shortage of tropes in horror that are overused to the point of tedium. Whole horror franchises have been built off of cataloging and mocking these tropes. So you could just say that if a movie contains enough of these tropes that it fits into the genre. And I suppose that's less wrong than the previous more common definitions, but it still doesn't really work. If that were the case, what makes A Quiet Place a horror movie? That it has monsters in it? Monsters are a trope of horror movies, so if the movie has monsters, it's a horror movie. In that case, why is Pacific Rim not a horror movie? It has even more monsters, big ones. And let us not forget the most horrific movie of them all, Monsters, Inc. How come Final Destination is a horror movie? Because people die in it? People die in lots of movies. Half of all people die in Avengers Infinity War, but that's not a horror movie. I'm not scared of you, Purple Man. Matt, you donkus, you lied to everyone. This video is about what horror is, and heretofore, you've been talking about what horror ain't. So we know what horror is not is, so what is it is? I can tell you what it is for me. A piece of media has to meet 3 conditions for it to be considered horror. It must be fictional. The whole world is full of scary shit. You can make a movie where someone gets stalked by a serial killer, sure, that's a horror movie. You make a movie where you outline the true events of an actual serial killer's rampage? That doesn't really strike me as horror. I might even consume it for the same reasons, to get horribly spookified. That's not horror. To me, anyway. Now this line gets a little fuzzy sometimes. Most horror movies, indeed, most movies, borrow from some sort of real-life events. Famously, Leatherface is partially inspired by American serial killer Ed Gein. But the events of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre are still fictional, despite what the title crawl might imply. Movies like The Conjuring, the Amityville Horror, or The Sacrament are loosely based on real events, but fictionalized enough that the point seems moot. Especially the Amityville Horror, because the true story it was based on was also mostly lies. Point is, horror ought to be fictional. It must concern the macabre. Death, corruption, pain. Horror needs to have a dark atmosphere. That doesn't mean the screen has to be literally dark. I mean, you gotta make it unsettling in some way or pertain to something unsettling. Midsommar, for example, is very bright and colorful, but a sense of dread and unease pervades the entire thing. You know something bad is going to happen. Nobody could get half an hour into that movie and not think those characters are in danger. Now, Matt, you might say, isn't that equally subjective to the wrong definitions? Aren't you essentially arguing that horror just has to feel like horror? Isn't that kind of a useless tautological definition? No. Shut up. The characters involved must be scared. I don't think horror needs to scare you, but I think something can't meaningfully be said to be horror if the characters within it don't find the central conceit scary once they are made aware of it. If everybody saw Dracula and was like, oh hey, that dude drinks blood, weird, that wouldn't be horror anymore. Now, if you add in another character who's super freaked out because nobody's taking this Dracula problem seriously, suddenly it's horror again. That's scary. What if nobody was scared of Dracula and he was going around suckling up all the blood? These three elements take your typical monster mash and transform it into a graveyard smash. I wrote this part of the script while drinking. Take any horror movie, plug it into these criteria, and it works. Reanimator, check. Return of the Living Dead, check. Rosemary's Baby, check. Ghoulies 3, Ghoulies Go to College, check. Now go ahead and try to name a movie that isn't horror but meets all three of these characteristics. Toy Story? No way. Tiptoes? Don't think so. Shrek Forever After? Not at all, pal. There's something about it still feels really unsatisfying. Codifying the genre in this way or in any way kind of makes me feel weird. It feels so reductive. Because this is a subject I feel so passionately about. What am I going to say to people? Oh, I love fiction with a macabre atmosphere where the characters within the story are scared. When you put it that way, why? What do you get out of it? I think a certain type of person is drawn to horror. Maybe you're like me and you're a deeply fearful person riddled with anxiety. Maybe like me, you spend so much time obsessing over dark thoughts and fears that seeing them reflected back to you on a movie screen feels relaxing, almost calming. Maybe you get an adrenaline rush when you see something scary happen in a movie. Maybe you're one of the few people that welcomes a good old-fashioned jump scare. And for the record, no, I'm not going to do a joke where I jump scare now, because a lot of people really don't like them for a lot of really good reasons. I'm not a dick like that. Maybe you just like thinking about the things you're not supposed to think about. You like to look where you're not supposed to look. Maybe the fact that horror is lurid and perverse is exactly what attracts you to it. Maybe you're a murderer looking for inventive ways to kill people. Actually, wait, no, actually, forget that last one. That last one's bad. I don't like that last one. Don't count that. Edit that out. And I think what's missing from any definition of the genre is the passion and love fans feel for these much maligned and misunderstood works of art, and the community which naturally and spontaneously developed around celebrating them. If you're a horror fan, you know the feeling of excitement you get when you mention some really obscure movie to somebody and the person you're talking to has actually seen it. I guess you could say the true horror was the friends we made along the way. Well, that's the end of this video. Why don't you like the video and also subscribe here on youtube.com. You can ring the little bell down there. That'll tell you when I release new videos. Also, come back next week. I'm going to talk about Basket Case.